Okay, everybody, welcome to the bonus class on the Gospel of Luke. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Start my slideshow here. It's good you're here. Okay, we're going to start with the title of this 1 hour class, The Parable of the Man Who Fell Among the Robbers. Not typically how we think of this story, right? And that's the first thing I want to stop and do is think about traditionally how we've understood this story. So the title presumes the Good Samaritan is kind of unexpected, right? But there's something wrong with calling somebody a good and then a class of people, right? So imagine, right, if we were going to call somebody a good immigrant or a good Jew or any other class of people, right? It kind of presumes that the good is the exception, right? So as opposed to calling this parable the Good Samaritan, we're going to call this the parable of the man who fell among the robbers, right? So that's the first thing we're going to start with is kind of rethinking the name of that. Here's what we're going to cover. We're going to start with actually reading the parable itself. And I think this is really important because this is a really iconic parable, right? This is the one that is almost like a part of our culture, of our ethos. It's really important, I think, to strip all that away and figure out what is actually in there and what might not be in there, right? Then we're going to look at some of the most iconic art that's been done about this parable, but also look at some of the contemporary artists who have taken this parable and painted it. Then we're going to dive into the players, and we're going to talk about each of the key players and talk about what challenges this parable presents. And then I'm going to break you up into small groups for a time of reflection. Okay, so a lot to accomplish. Anybody needs my attention, just wave, okay, or come off mute and tell me, okay? So let's start with actually reading the parable. Anybody want to take the first chunk?
I will.
Thank you, Diane.
On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor?
Okay, next section. Would somebody read that?
I will.
Thank you, Shirley.
In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.
Thanks, Shirley. And one last one. Would somebody read this one?
I'll do it, Marci.
Thank you.
Which one of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise.
Thank you, Lori. Okay, that is the parable. There's not a lot there, right? So let's look at how that little story has been interpreted by artists through time. Okay. Okay. So some powerful images, and I especially appreciate some of the more contemporary takes on that one. We're going to come back to that because I think it'll tie back to what's the whole point of the story. So, okay, let's talk about the start of the story. Here's how the story starts. Jesus is being questioned by a lawyer about how to have eternal life. And this is a really, really standard question, and it's a really, really standard answer. So if you think about the Jewish framework, Jesus is a Jew, all of his followers are Jews, they are existing within that Jewish scripture, that Jewish theology, that Jewish liturgy, right? Standard Jewish answer. Love of God, love of neighbor. There's nothing unusual about that one, right? But then the lawyer asks a second question, right? Which is, okay, well, who is my neighbor? And the crux of what the lawyer's asking here is who's an insider and who is an outsider? A good question that continues to this day. Here's the key players. The first one is the victim, and the victim is unnamed, though it's kind of presumed that this is going to be a Jew. This person is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's a pretty dangerous road at that time. If you think back to the story itself, it said that he is traveling down from Jerusalem. And geographically speaking, Jerusalem is actually up high, right? And then Jericho would be down. So he would be down. It's a downward path from Jerusalem to Jericho. The road drops 3,300 feet in elevation. It's a long journey. It's 17 miles, all downhill. He is wounded. He is naked. He is half dead. When you think about the story in a global standpoint, the person in the ditch could be anyone, could be everyone. Let's talk about the robbers. The text says that the robbers stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. The text does not say that they robbed him, right? The Greek translation for robbers is the exact same term that Luke is going to use later on when Jesus turns the tables and he talks about the den of robbers. It's the same word. So why does that matter? Because if you remember back to our study of Luke and Jesus turning over the tables, right? It wasn't anger at the injustice of the selling of what was going on in the temple. It was the anger at the injustice of this system of dominance where the small number of wealthy landowners and Jews held the political power within the Roman structure, right? Same word, robbers. So it may be that what Luke is saying here is that this story isn't really about robbing, it's more about insurrection and commentary against that larger system. Could be one of the reasons why he does this story. The other key players are the Levite and the priest. And this is the one where I would say through the centuries, Christians have consistently put on anti-Jewish lenses to interpret this. And so we got to be really, really mindful of how we think about this. There's been a lot of work to deconstruct those anti-Jewish understandings. So here's what the text says. It says that the Levite and the priest passed by on the other side, which means they crossed the street to avoid him. So they go out of their way to avoid the injured man. They see the injured man, they go out of their way. What is not in the text is why they do it. Traditionally, Christians have understood this passage as about anti-purity, like either the Levite and the priest could not touch the individual because of Jewish understandings of purity. That really doesn't hold up when you take away kind of that anti-Jewish lens. There's nothing in this story about purity laws. That's not scriptural. It's an anti-Jewish reading of the text. And Christians have a long, full history of anti-Jewish readings of the text. So what is it then? Why is this in here? The Levite and the priest for Jesus's audience, that Jewish audience, would have been the respected elders in the community, right? You would have expected the Levite and the priest to stop and take care about them. That's not what happened. And so there's a bit of a surprise twist, right? What should have happened is the respected elders, the respected individuals, the Levite and the priest should have seen the injured man and they should have stopped. That didn't happen. This is not a story about distrust of those religious authorities. This is not a story about purity laws. So take those off the table, and what you have is a Jewish audience that would have said, whoa, those two really should have stopped, right? So it's a surprise value. So let's talk about the other player, which is the Samaritan. So who are the Samaritans? If you think back to your understanding of Israel's history, right? So we know that in the mid-5th century, the Babylonians come in, they destroy the nation of Judea, they take away all of the priests, all of the people, the scholars, all of the scribes, and they take them into Babylon, the Babylonian exile, right? So they come in, they destroy the kingdom, they destroy Jerusalem, and they take with them all of the kind of the elite. They don't take everybody. So who they leave behind? It were the people that became known as the Samaritans. That's where the Samaritans came out of. They were the left behind people when everybody else went into exile. Now, in the Gospel of John, we hear that Samaritans do not share things in common with the Samaritans, that traditional Israelites do not share things in common with the Samaritans. Matthew is going to tell us when Jesus sends out those disciples, do not go to Samaria. And if you think back to Luke, he's going to tell us that Samaria did not receive him because his face was set for Jerusalem. So what happened was after the Babylonian exile, all the scribes, all the priests are taken into exile for 3 generations. What remains in Judea, this Samaritan population, is going to develop different traditions and different understandings of the Hebrew scriptures than who will come back from the Babylonian exile. It becomes an us-them kind of scenario. For those of you that did the study of the book of Isaiah, you'll remember that this is what all about the third part of Isaiah is about. It's about this first part is before the exile. The second part is when they're in the exile. The third part is about coming back. And how do they create a new community with the people who had been there and developed new traditions? It wasn't very successful. Those are the Samaritans. Jesus's audience would have thought of them as an enemy. So for Jesus's audience, if they're imagining themselves in the ditch, they're probably thinking that man is going to come finish me off, right? Okay, so here's the context of the story. What's Jesus doing here by using a Samaritan? Jesus is drawing on maximum rhetorical impact. So Jesus was a really, really good storyteller, right? And Jesus is using this story with the shock value of the Levite and the priest moving on, and then a Samaritan, who they would have understood as the enemy, coming in and being the savior. So he's asking his audience to consider, okay, who is the enemy here? So here's the content of the story. The Samaritan is moved to action by compassion. The Samaritan treats the injury. The Samaritan brings the victim to an inn. The Samaritan pays for the inn. And then the Samaritan basically threatens the innkeeper that he is going to come back and check up and make sure that the victim has been well cared for, right? So not only is he compassionate with his actions, he actually is putting money in the game. So he's paying for this individual to be well cared while he has to go on. This is one of my favorite quotes about the Good Samaritan, and it comes from, oddly enough, Margaret Thatcher. Nobody would remember the Good Samaritan if he had only good intentions. He had money as well. So the Good Samaritan actually puts out money. He doesn't just put out compassion actions. He actually puts his money where it is. Okay, so let's think about what the Samaritan did. First and foremost, he stopped. And because he was willing to stop, he could see the situation that the victim was in. In observing that situation, the Samaritan felt compassion. The translation of that word compassion is moved to the depth of his being. Moved to the depth of his being. That's a really kind of powerful one to hold on to. Moved to the depth of his being. Now, because the Samaritan stopped, he really was able to see what was going on. And because he could see what was going on, he had that compassion. He was moved to the depth of his being. If he had not stopped, if he had not had compassion, chances are the victim would still be in the ditch. Okay, and then Jesus brings the message home. And he asks, after telling the story, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robber? The lawyer, the expert in the law, replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise, right? So the story closes by Jesus saying, okay, who's the neighbor, right? Now, if you think back to the original question, right, the question was, who is my neighbor? And then really, instead of answering that question, the parable really talked about how to be a neighbor, how to love, and how to show mercy. That's the direct answer. It's about how to be a neighbor, not necessarily who is a neighbor. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We've gone through that really, really quickly. Questions, comments, reactions, anything on the background of the story itself. It's an iconic one. Go ahead. Oh, Diane, you're on mute.
I never knew who was a Samaritan. I didn't know that
Yeah.
they were actually Jews then. They were just left behind.
They were, but while they were left behind for several generations.
Yeah.
And in those generations, they developed different traditions, different biblical understanding, different liturgies, different, I'd say theologies, but they weren't radically different, but they were different enough.
Never knew that. That's really an interesting aspect of the story.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
Were they, are they still today? Are there Samaritan Jews?
I do not believe so, but I don't know that answer, Paul.
Okay.
But what's going to happen, 50 years after Jesus tells this story is there's no Jews whatsoever left in Jerusalem, in Israel. So that's when the temple is just Rome comes in, they destroy basically the entire structure. All Jews are basically either killed or sent out for the dysphoria.
So then the Jewish faith is built back on the beliefs and practices that were not Samaritan?
Correct. And what happens when Rome comes in, right? So there's, even during the time of Jesus, right, there's all of this tension with Rome. It's an occupied territory, and there's flare-ups and there's flare-ups, and boy, that tension builds and builds and builds in the decades after Jesus dies until it absolutely erupts, and there's a huge kind of insurrection. The insurrection, the leaders of the rebels take over Jerusalem. And it's at that point in time that Rome sends 2 legions into Israel. And then they're going to start up north, and it takes them 2 years to lay siege in Jerusalem. And when they finally basically enter Jerusalem, they're going to destroy all of Jerusalem. The number of people that are killed is massive. It's probably about 1/3 of all Jews worldwide die during that occupation. The ones who do escape, they leave Israel and settle all around the Mediterranean. So it's the spreading out of the Jewish populations all around the Mediterranean. And it's the end of temple worship. And when that ends, then Judaism, basically, as we understand it now with rabbinic Judaism, rises up. So that's kind of the crisis point that makes that all happen.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Bernie.
The term priest, are we referring to a rabbi?
So this is before that temple is destroyed. And so rabbi, the way we understand rabbi today, doesn't really develop until after the temple is destroyed. That's the new Judaism that's going to emerge once the temple is destroyed. So priest is kind of a pre-temple destroyed term. So we've encountered priests in other of the New Testament. So they are the individuals who, and there's actually typically different names, like the Jewish name Cohen is usually associated with the priestly class who had very specific roles in the temple. So that priest is really closely linked to those temple roles. And again, that's all going to end once the temple is destroyed by the Romans in around the year 66.
Thank you.
Everybody good? Okay, it's a hard story because it's really asking, okay, how do you want to be in the world, right? So here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I'd like to do is break you up into small groups to kind of talk that through. And again, we're really thinking about who is our neighbor, Who have we traditionally thought of as our neighbor? And what is this parable encouraging us to rethink about that? And then what are your key takeaways from the parable? So thinking about who is your neighbor? Who have you traditionally thought of as your neighbor? Who is this story challenging you to think about as your neighbor? And what does that look like for you moving forward? Okay. And what's your big takeaways from that? So let me go ahead and I'm going to set up some rooms real quick. Most rooms will have 3, some people will have 4. I'm going to let you go for about 12 minutes to just kind of think through this parable, okay? So I'll put the questions in a message to everybody. If you haven't done breakout rooms before, all you have to do is click join and you will automatically be sent into your room, okay? And I will pull you back out in 12 minutes. Have fun, everybody.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone.
I got
Hello.
cut off, Marci. Gosh.
No, it was a
That's
great
okay.
story.
I'm gonna go ahead and actually just call on each room. So let's start with room 1. I think that was Bernie, Lori, Chris, Carol. Is that right?
Yes, I think so,
Okay.
yeah.
Feedback, thoughts, reactions, key insights, key takeaways. What did you all come up with?
You want me to start, you guys? Or go ahead.
Go ahead, Laurie.
Yeah, go ahead, Lori.
Yeah, so we spent a good amount of time talking about what a neighbor is, and you know, from the very, you know, local definition of people who live near you, your family. And then we talked about, when we say neighbors, do we really mean people like me? Is that what a neighbor is? People like me? And how do we expand that? So we talked about expanding that definition both globally. So the Ukrainian people, the Russian people are our neighbors. And then I shared a story from a very local story where I was walking my dog up on Queen Anne this morning, and you know, it's early morning, and there's a homeless guy passed out in a doorway, or sleeping, or hopefully not dead. And you know, my gut reaction was, ooh, I'm not sure what I'm dealing with here. Gonna give him a wide berth. You know, he looks peaceful. And then it's bugged me all morning. Like, why didn't I stop and say, are you okay? Can I get you anything? Because he's my neighbor. So we just talked about how we think the takeaway from the parable is just pushing us to expand that definition of neighbor, both, you know, philosophically, culturally, globally. You know, at one point, Bernie said, it's anybody we have compassion for. And that's a big definition. You know, I think most of us have compassion for most people. So yeah, great conversation.
Okay. Who else was in that room? Anything else to add? Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, no. You said who else was in that room?
Oh,
Is
anything
Lori
else
did
to
it.
add?
Lori did it very well.
Yeah, good summation.
Thank you.
Thank you, group 1. Okay, who was in the second room? I think, Marilee, who was in your room?
Oh, and Marie and Sue.
Okay, Second room, Sue, Marie, Paul, Mary Lee, what did you all come up with?
I wasn't here for most of the discussion because I just got home. I'm probably not the best one to talk. Let Paul talk.
So we thought that probably a neighbor, unlike what we normally think of as people who live by us or think like us or similar to us, it was more likely to be anybody in need and that we would have compassion for, as the other group one put it well. And we were interested in the part where you said something about the priest and the Levite had to do with rebels or rebellion. We didn't
Insurrection.
quite understand that.
So there's some understandings of that word robber when you look at the Greek translation, that it's the same word that Luke uses when he tells the story of Jesus turning over the tables. And we know when we studied that really is a story about insurrection and rebellion, right? So Jesus isn't turning over the tables because he's upset that they're doing offerings. You know, that's part of Jewish culture. He isn't upset that they're selling things in the temple. That's been done that way for centuries. He's upset about the fact that the money and the taxes are being used to oppress kind of the common people and the people on the margins so atrociously, and that power is being held within that system of occupation. That, you know, it's an occupied country, right? And the Romans are occupying it. It's a heavily militarized occupation. Anybody who rebels against that occupation is killed. It's going to happen to Jesus within a few days of him turning over those tables. And the power structure within Israel is held, it's kind of token by a few wealthy landowning Jews and a few priestly class. And that's it. And that's what he's upset about. So it's odd, some scholars find it odd that Luke uses that same term for robber in the Good Samaritan that he uses for when Jesus starts screaming, it's a den of robbers. So then there's the wondering, okay, is this story of the Good Samaritan having something to do with that rebellion, that sort of rebellion? So that, I hope that helps. It's because of the translation.
Yeah.
You're kind of saying then that part of the problem with the Levite and the priest are they didn't do what they were expected to do?
That potentially they are in that class of individuals that Jesus was really angry at.
So he showed them in less than their best light.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, group 3. I think who's left? Shirley and Chuck and Diane? Okay, what did you all come up with?
I'll start. This parable in studying it made me very uncomfortable. And there's many groups I support financially and voting wise and all that, but I don't know if I had passed the person in the ditch, would I have stopped kind of talking like Lori is, what would I do? And so that made me think of bringing it more on a personal level. And I like the other groups bringing up, it's who you have compassion for. And so, it really has me thinking of one-on-one. And we also then talked about neighbors who think differently than we do. And in some ways politically or whatever. And I don't often spend time with those people. to find out what's beneath that and what we could have in common. So it's another thing that I've taken away from this. For me.
Chuck or Shirley, anything you want to add?
No, and I think she covered it. Although I liked what Diane said about the one-on-one
Mhm.
business, because you know people in a different way
Yeah.
when it's one-on-one.
It's pretty easy to have compassion for people who think the way you think and look the way you do, and be suspect of others perhaps. But my block is pretty diverse in terms of political thought.
Mm.
And I mean, I see my neighbor over to my immediate left, they were really active in showing their pride and support for that. They have a son who's gay and has, and they're just wonderful neighbors. It's easy for me to have compassion and understand what they're going through. I have neighbors on the other side who are, not just flag flyers, but they beat you with the flag, and they have taken the flag from me. It feels like 4th of July was really hard for me this
Yeah.
year, especially in Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Diane, can I just going on what you said, I think that personal relationship I struggle with because, well, I haven't been here, but it's not any different in Minnesota where I lived in neighborhoods where people are more alike. But Chris, you had a really interesting suggestion at the end, or that you had been aware of, that a neighbor was going to offer a dinner party with. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's really
Sure.
interesting.
Actually, I became aware of it after I lived at Lake Desire in Renton, and I'm on the Lake Desire Facebook page, and there was a neighbor a quarter of a mile away, not exactly in our neighborhood, but within walking distance. And she was, I can't think of, my hair is white, words come in and out of my head. Islam is the word that comes up, but that's not it.
Muslim?
Yes, thank you very much, Marci. Muslim, and she and her husband they have a group center that all the neighbors in their neighborhood can take part in. And she was reserving that every Friday night or whatever. And she was having dinner parties with her native food. And she was inviting 12 people at a pop, men, women, couples, whatever, children. And they were allowed to ask any question they wanted to ask about her religion, where she came from. And I don't remember now where it was, but it was, and I thought, man, what a great idea. And I also said about a half a mile down the street was a huge Sikh neighborhood. We all say Sikh, it's Sikh. And it's like how compartmentalized we all are, with people that are just like us in neighborhoods. Anyway, that's what I was talking about. That's when I got cut off.
Well, thank you all for doing that, for going into small groups. And, we started this with the Luke Bible study, and we'll pick it back up when we go back into the Genesis stories in November. But a couple of comments on some of the things that you said. I did this great training a couple of years ago. I kid you not, I have no idea what the training was on, but I took away from it this statement that I put on every computer that I have owned since then in a little sticky, and it says, progress, not perfection. And so I think about that when I think about, in particular, these are daunting stories. These are daunting calls. They should make us uncomfortable, right? That's the whole point. That's why these stories were preserved, is to kind of shake us into that period of uncomfortableness. But I think what we're looking for isn't perfection. We're looking for progress. We're looking for some way into these stories to start being a part of the solution. There's another part of that that I want to ask you all to consider. We've spent a lot of time thinking about these stories as our own individual actions. This is a tweet I came across that I thought was really interesting, though, that kind of challenges us to think about this story in a broader sense, right? The Good Samaritan story is not just an example of compassionate spirituality. It's a critique against religious passivity. If church people won't work for justice and mercy, God will find some other people who will. So there's also not only kind of that uncomfortable call as individuals, but kind of an uncomfortable call for all people of faith to stand up for justice and mercy, which, you know, I think about everything going on in the world right now, and in particular our country. And I think maybe this parable has something to say about all about that, right? So here's the concluding message from Jesus. When it comes down to who to love, whether they are an insider or an outsider, a neighbor or a stranger, it does not matter. Love is indiscriminate, right? The real question is not about how to get to heaven. It is not about eternal life. The real question is about how to live ethically in the present and to bring that sort of indiscriminate, radical, crazy, unconditional love to the world now. So that's I think the takeaway. Can we perfect that in every day with everything we do? No. I don't think that's what this story is calling us to do, but it is calling us to be uncomfortable with the message and to start thinking about how we can move forward into that call of indiscriminate love. Okay, let me talk about what's coming up next. So I told some of you before the rest got on, I'm writing the class right now on the history of the Bible. This is a class that Bernie asked me if I could teach. The title of the class is The Torrid History of the Bible. And I shared that it is very torrid, and I'm running out of space for all of the torrid twists and turns of the Bible. So that's going to be in September, on September 20th. Again, these are all at 1 o'clock, all via Zoom. And then also we're going to keep going with history in October. So we did ancient Christianity, and we're taking on history of the Reformation. So it's going to be 3 different classes. We're going to start by learning about what happened leading up to the Reformation that created such a powder keg. So we're going to start to talk about that. We're going to spend time on some of the rebels before Luther. And then we're going to spend some time learning about Luther, and then the spread out of Luther in Germany into Switzerland, and Calvin, who is the UCC's kind of forefather. And then we're going to talk about what happened in England, and also how the Catholic Church responded to the Reformation, which, as a priest once said to me, that's not the correct word. The correct word is the revolution, not the Reformation. So it depends on who's telling the story, I guess, is who gets to name it, right? So that'll be in October, and then in November we're going to start into the big stories in Genesis, and we'll be going through those. So, okay, questions, comments, final thoughts? Anybody? Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I read the parable again this morning. On Friday, at my friend, I told you about my friend who died. There's a mass for him. Yeah. And I'm going to read, I've been asked to read something from Acts. And the first line also conjures up who's your neighbor. Yeah. It says, in truth, I see that God shows no partiality. Rather, in every nation, whoever fears him and acts uprightly is acceptable to him. So that doesn't exclude anyone really, does it?
No.
You know, so I just, it's kind of interesting how I see
Yeah.
that repeated message, you know.
Indiscriminate, crazy, radical love.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
I
a
like it.
beautiful call. Beautiful call. So I'm going to remind you all what it means to be compassionate. Moved to the depth of our beings.
Wow.
As you go forth this week, may we all be moved to the depth of our beings. Okay, everyone.